I, with my colleagues Larry Liebovitch and Robin Vallacher, are here to launch a new book that I'll give you some context for, and then both Larry and Robin will talk about different aspects of it. But I wanted to start by just asking you a question. And I want to ask you a question and ask you if you can be honest with me. You think you can be honest with me? Just between us? So, I'm interested in knowing how many of you in your life have gotten into some type of dispute with someone, sibling, parents, children, spouse, or maybe somebody at work, from school who you were close with at some point. And that dispute, that conflict just got stuck. And it got to a place where you did the best you could to kind of tolerate the situation, but you really couldn't work your way out of it, and ultimately didn't. And it really just became a part of your life that was frustrating, and you sort of avoided as much as possible. So just, if you can, just show me like how many have been into those. Come on, be honest. I've had many with some of you, so I yeah. All right. So most people here have had one of those. How about like 2 or 3 of those? Anybody have sort of 2 or 3 of those that they're willing to admit to? All right. That's a particularly troublesome group over there. Yeah. And then like more than 5 of those? Have you been involved in more than 5? All right. So that's the good news. The good news is that these kind of conflicts, research tells us, are fairly uncommon, right? They don't happen very often, but when they do happen, either in our personal lives or our professional lives or in a community or in the international community, they can really inflict harm, damage, become really miserable, distract us psychologically, and then if they happen in communities, they can become extremely expensive in terms of human lives, trauma, money, they also are known to be particularly destabilizing. So they can destabilize a relationship, they can destabilize a family, they can destabilize a community and a region. So they're very important to understand, but they're the types of conflicts we know probably least about. There's been a long legacy of the study of conflict and conflict resolution and processes and negotiation processes and mediation processes. A lot of it kick-started by this guy over here, Deutsch. And so there's been systematic research on that for decades now. But there are still sort of certain types of conflicts which we don't really understand, that don't seem to operate by the same kind of rules. And that's something that we've been studying. I've been studying on and off now for about 20 years. Our team has been working on it for, I don't know, something like 7 or 8 years, I think, together. I think. It seems to keep getting longer.
20 dog years.
20 dog years. So like an illustration of this is that there's good news in the international community in that we are better at negotiating ends to wars. In the period from 1983 to 2000, there were more wars negotiated to a peace process than had happened in the previous 200 years. So more and more diplomats, mediators, members of the international community, members of governments understand the value of trying to sit at a table and negotiate a peace process and have that be the solution as opposed to a military victory. I mean, in fact, since the Cold War, the number of military victories to peace processes has flipped, and so now there are many more peace processes and negotiated agreements. The bad news is that about 25% of negotiated agreements around war collapse within about 5 years. They relapse into violence. And when that occurs, the probability of them getting stuck into a cycle of kind of more and less peacefulness and then violence and more and less peacefulness and violence exponentially increases. And it's these kinds of patterns that we're trying to understand, that we've been trying to sort of study and work on. So when I first started to work in this area that we call intractable conflict, people call protracted social conflicts. Sometimes people focus specifically on moral conflicts as this type, but there are a lot of different ways to talk about these things. when we started to study them first here in our lab, we studied a lot of the pieces. So we studied identity, the importance of identity, and how people's identity changes when they grow in relation to an enemy, and how that becomes part of the problem. We studied humiliation and the role of humiliation and the experience of humiliation in fueling these. And we studied other kinds of sort of motivational processes. What are the types of motives that really keep people stuck in these types of conflicts? But I found that that work was sort of wanting, because we were understanding little pieces of what seemed to be a much more complicated problem, and without a better sense of the forest, a better sense of the whole. So we started to think and work more systemically, right, trying to understand how these sort of different pieces come together to affect these long-term conflicts in your life or in the international community. And I found that wanting too, because a lot of the systems thinking was very crude. It was sort of saying, well, things are complicated and they're related to each other, so good luck. But there wasn't much more moving us into a more sophisticated understanding of, well, what does that mean? And then I happened across the work of two characters, Robin Vallacher and Andrzej Novak. Andrzej Novak is a colleague who is on faculty at Florida Atlantic University with Robin, but also on faculty at the University of Warsaw, at the Warsaw School of Social Studies. He, I think, directs 12 centers and is a very busy character. And together, Robin and Andrzej had begun to work on something that they called nonlinear dynamical systems theory. And this was trying to take insights mostly from applied mathematics, but physics and applied mathematics predominantly, and bring those ideas and those methods and those approaches to the science and study of peace and conflict to try to bring it into psychology. So they had done considerable work in different areas of psychology trying to understand, well, how does that lens, complexity science, help us understand psychological phenomenon? So we reached out to them, as I said, several years ago, and said, we're working on this thing called impossible conflicts. They're very complicated. There are a lot of pieces, and your approach may help. And so we joined forces then and started to work together to bring a team together that could help us think about this. So at that point, Larry Liebovitch joined us. Larry Liebovitch has a background in astrophysics. He's the Dean of Mathematics and Natural Sciences at Queens College. And we brought together Andrea Bartoli, who is an anthropologist but has worked a lot in peace processes. We brought Bui-Wrzosinska, who's a social psychologist who works on peace. We brought Naira Musallam, who is an organizational psychologist who also is a Palestinian Israeli, and she has worked extensively on peace. And Katharina Kugler as well, who's a German colleague who works at the University of Munich. Did I miss anybody? That's the team, right? We're all authors on this, so I think that's it.
Did you get Andrea Bartoli?
Andrea Bartoli, yes, and Andrzej. So this group came together and talked. We drank a lot of coffee, and we walked around a lot, and we talked for a couple of years and began to try to think about how might these new ideas help us add value to our understanding of peace and conflict dynamics, particularly these ones that get into these kind of stuck patterns that seem to go nowhere. So we were funded by a group called the James S. McDonald Foundation, who fund work in complexity science, and typically they fund people that are a little weird and a little crazy and not quite ready for like NSF grants, but who have some kind of promise, and so that was basically us at that time. And they funded us for, I think, 3 years to come together and try to develop theory and research in this area, which we did. And that work culminated in a lot of different, it's had a lot of different kind of effects. The effects have kind of cascaded in different areas. So part of it has been in conducting studies and research in the science of complexity science, which is a hybrid, our approach is a hybrid of complexity science, peace and conflict studies, and social psychology primarily. So we've done a lot of different types of research, qualitative studies of case studies such as the conflict in Mozambique. We've done laboratory research, we've done survey research, so a lot of different types of research. We've also been trying to apply it. So A lot of the research papers were published in journals that few people other than psychologists read, I guess a couple of physics journals as well. We then wrote a book published in 2011 called The 5%, which was an attempt to say, okay, so how does this really help? If I'm a mediator, if I'm a negotiator, if I'm stuck in one of these situations, how practically might this help? And so that book came out in 2011, and that has been an attempt again to really translate it into practice. But what was missing really was a coherent summary of the science. What is the science behind it? What's the theory behind it? What's the research that has been conducted? And how does that directly inform the practice? So basically telling the whole story. And that's what this book is that we're here to launch tonight, which is called Attracted to Conflict, Dynamic Foundations of Destructive Social Relations. And this is an attempt for us to bring to the practice the science, the theory, and the empirical studies that have gone into our recommendations for practice. I do want to say that over the past couple of years, there is more and more resonance and acceptance of this work, which is really kind of paradigm-changing work. It does not take a business-as-usual approach to resolving conflict, sort of talking it out. It really understands the power of these conflicts and the context in which they're in, and the need to alter the dynamics of the context if you're able to resolve any particular conflict. So it's in some ways paradigm shifting and it's paradigm changing, but it's being used and applied more and more in different areas of science, and particularly in the peace and conflict world. So this past summer, we convened an institute for a week with about 40 peacemakers, peace builders, who are particularly interested in how these tools can be used on the ground in South Africa and in the various settings that they work around the world. So there's a nascent movement in the applied world. There are a lot of innovative people working in institutions like the World Bank, like the UN, that are particularly interested in this approach. And so we felt it critical that we be clear on what the science is behind the approach, so that they know at least what we know to date on the research. So that's what we're here to celebrate. So first I'm going to ask, I think, Larry Liebovitch to come up. He's going to talk a little bit, he's going to put up a bunch of equations and walk you through some mathematics, I think. No, he's going to talk a little bit about the value of complexity science and mathematics to the study of this, and then Robin will take us further.
I have the equations on the wrong side of the pad, so you don't get to see them. I worry a little bit sometimes. We have a copy of this book in my office when people walk into my dean's office at Queens College across the river from here, and they see the title that says Attracted to Conflict, Dynamics of Destructive Social Relationships. I wonder if that's the wrong kind of priming to have for people walking into my office. So someone I know who became a philosopher said that he became a philosopher because, I guess, when he was growing up in the 1950s, he read these strange and amazing comics, which were these sort of slightly intellectual comic books. And he said at one point, someone came from another planet and was talking to the people here on Earth. And he said, on my planet, we have colors you have never seen. And he kept thinking about this. He couldn't picture a color he had never seen. And that was one of the motivations that drove him to being a philosopher. And in a way, that's the problem we face in science. In many areas of science, it's a problem we face in terms of conflict resolution, is there are things going on and we need new ways of looking at them. We need to identify colors we've never seen before. So how do we do that? One of the ways we do that is by looking at analogies, by seeing something somewhere else that maybe we can apply over here. And that's sort of the process that Peter was describing. So one of the areas that, as Peter had sought out Robin and Andrzej in Florida, and I know Robin and Andrzej there, which is how I got involved with this. So my little path of this is I was in Florida for 17 years and are now back here in New York. So I've made the reverse migration, going up instead of down. But what the area that they work on are applications of dynamical systems. And what dynamical systems means to them are really metaphors that come out of mathematics. And I actually work on the mathematics of that, these equations that Peter threatened that I would show you. And so I've worked on mathematical systems and trying to understand and make models of the patterns of stars and hydrogen gas moving in galaxies, of the patterns that potassium ions make in going through proteins in the cell membrane, and lately of models of how people interact with each other in conflicts, interactions between clients, between therapists and their clients in psychotherapy. And what we learn from mathematics, from an entirely separate group of things, is how things change in time. And these can be systems that have a few pieces, or have a few pieces that interact so strongly with each other that they produce very unusual patterns that you would never expect they would produce. Sometimes those systems are called chaotic systems. And here the word chaos means just the opposite of what you think it means. It means systems that are actually completely deterministic. You can write down all the rules of the system, but then you can't predict what they're going to do next. And there are other systems that have a large number of pieces, or networks of pieces of how models of how infections are spread from one person to another. So out of this wealth of material, of how people look at things that change in time, of how one or many things influence each other, that's led to a different set of metaphors which Peter and Robin and other people in the group have been able to apply to see a different color in terms of what happens in conflicts. So it's also interesting that each of us in this group contributes in a different way. And for me, this is a tremendous amount of fun because I get to learn all these other things and to deal with real practitioners who actually go out into the real world. Actually, universities are also the real world, although we don't like to admit that, and do things. So the attempt of this book was to use ideas, some of us, and to a degree, Andrzej Novak and I, actually doing real mathematical calculations in a very specific way, in terms of the analogies and the metaphors that we've learned from the mathematics to apply to it. And Peter and the different other co-authors each deal with different real-life type of conflict situations or models or theories about those situations. So it's been sort of fun to put all this together, as I said, to try to get a sense of a color that we really had never seen before.
Great, thank you. I think your clicker's up there, so you can just try that.
Is this on? Okay.
So
Warming up.
Tell a couple of jokes.
All right. I'm the only person here with slides, which means one of two things. Either I'm really well prepared and really want to do a good job, or I don't know what the hell I'm talking about without slides.
You want us to step by the mic so that they
Right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Hitachi. And no input is detected. I should point that out. Okay, because that's clear. Okay, so as Larry just pointed out, and I think it's Peter also, that this book is really an example of the very thing we're talking about. You think about a dynamical system, it has many moving parts that become organized in a fashion and it produces something totally unexpected. And the product of our output, the product of our work over the last several years is an example of that. Each of us brings to bear a different set of expertise, talents, personalities, and so forth. And out of that has come, I think, a pretty good set of products. And this book being the latest example of that. So I want to talk a little bit about, drop the equations of mathematics, because who cares, right? We want to talk about the metaphors again. And talk a little bit about how this relates to the issue of conflict. First thing I want to do is point out that when Peter called us, he was basically saying that despite all the efforts, and I can testify to this in social psychology, a lot of work has been done over the last 50, 60, 70 years, and we still haven't really cracked the nut. We don't know really how to solve conflicts and really understand them perfectly. So Andrea and I were very intrigued by that challenge, and we realized that there are certain reasons why the traditional approaches to conflict resolution don't work. One is that usually when you think about people solving conflicts, they use something from the outside coming in. For example, there's threats of force. You know, we'll invade your country, or we'll impose sanctions and make you guys stop fighting. Sometimes we promise aid. Often takes a form of almost explicit bribery, trying to get people to sort of set aside their differences and so forth. The problem with all these approaches, this coming from the outside with heavy-handed, explicit attempts with external force, is that psychology has taught us that external forces often has a paradoxical effect. In the very application of a reward to a child, for example, you tend to kill the very thing that they want to do anyway. A kid's playing with crayons, and you give money for it, and suddenly you don't like crayons anymore. Okay? There's another theory in psychology it's called reactance that says when people are told what to do, or when they feel a strong external force, they kind of rebel against it. So this idea of using external forces to come in, whether it's peacekeepers or negotiations or bribery or aid and so forth, can undermine the very process you're trying to create. The attempt says, how do you create an internal motivation to solve the problem? So you look at traditional social psychology as one way to do this. And these often don't work very well either. So attempts to appeal to people's humanity, they're better angels of their nature and so forth, often come up short. Appeals based on guilt, shame, or even pride, these are very powerful human emotions, often come up short as well. Persuasion, psychologists know a lot about persuasion, how to present arguments in just the right way, how to have rational appeals and emotional appeals and so forth. And these typically aren't very effective in getting even kids to stop fighting, couples to get into a good space in their relationship, nations to come to peace and so forth. Okay? Even appeals to self-interest. You know, if you guys just stop fighting, if you mend fences and learn to get along, look at all the resources you sit on top of. This region could be monumentally rich and wealthy and so forth. That doesn't quite cut it. Even appeals to long-term self-interest. In the long run, this is better for humanity and so forth. Lots of things have been tried in social psychology that don't seem to really be very effective in bringing about peace or stopping conflicts. Okay? So what we do, we take a little bit different tack on this. First of all, I thought we'd explain the word attracted. Larry made reference to this. Attracted to conflict. Why the word attracted? I mean, are people really attracted to conflict? There's nothing desirable or attractive about destructive relationships that become protracted and stuck in time. Anything but that. You know, you look at some of the international conflicts that have been festering for years, they're just emptying their banks, they're killing their kids, they're spoiling the resources for generations to come. There's nothing good to come of it. It's hard to see any long-term self-interest in these sorts of things. So it's not attraction in that sense. Okay? Instead, what attraction or attracted means in a dynamical system is the emergence of a coherent pattern that arises out of the organization of separate elements, as Larry described. So separate pieces tend to maybe function independently with their own degree of freedom, but they tend to influence each other and create a synthetic whole, an emergent whole. And this idea of systems, having systems across nature and through economics and sociology and psychology, having in common this emergence of coherent patterns really is a much more basic, fundamental way to look at how anything works than simply trotting out motives, goals, pleasures, desires, and so forth. We know in human psychology, for example, that some people get stuck into things like low self-esteem. That doesn't feel good. Why would a person maintain low self-esteem? And it's usually because that's more coherent. They can make sense out of their life, even though it's not pleasurable. So the idea of the formation of a pattern that makes sense is often the force that drives and creates systems. Okay? So you look at in weather patterns, you look at hurricanes, in economics, you can look at meltdowns and so forth. You know, hurricanes aren't pleasurable, and I don't think the water molecules give a damn whether they have a hurricane or not. In economic meltdowns, that doesn't help anybody, but they happen anyways. These are natural emergent properties that evolve through the interaction of different elements. Okay? Once a pattern is formed, it's very hard to disrupt. Once you have a coherent way of thinking about something, it's very hard to change your mental space and think about it differently. So in that sense, a coherent pattern functions as an attractor. It absorbs all your new thoughts, all the new energy in the system to maintain that coherent pattern. So even if it's destructive and unwanted, unpleasurable, undesirable, and so forth, the pattern itself has a lot of sticking power. It attracts new elements and new events to it. Okay? So that's where this title comes from, attracted to conflict, meaning that conflict operates as an attractor, a coherent pattern that attracts all the energy in the system. Okay? So with that in mind, what's a better way to resolve conflicts than to go through the techniques of persuasion and appeals to emotion and so forth? The simple idea, if this is really true, that conflicts form because they're coherent, create a new coherent pattern, create a new attractor, change the dynamics. Okay? And in the book we talk about actually three ways. I'm going to emphasize two ways of doing this. One is simply to destabilize an existing pattern. Okay? Reduce the system to its basic elements, so it's a lot of degrees of freedom there, and maybe, just maybe, you can reorganize the system in a different pattern. Okay? So in other words, you take all the moving pieces, all the different thoughts and feelings and memories and relations between people and so forth, destabilize them in such a way that it can be rebuilt and form a new pattern that's not quite so destructive. Another idea is to ignore the system altogether. Okay? Just step outside of the system altogether and try and create a new way of relating in a different context. Create a different pattern that may be totally different from the original context, and then maybe that new pattern becomes an attractor that someday will overtake and supplant the original pattern. Okay? When that happens, what you find is what's called nonlinear change, or catastrophic change, so that there's almost overnight, there's a sudden drift or transition from one way of behaving to a completely different way of relating to each other. Okay? And so the idea is conflicts are often resolved not through incremental, small, gradual steps, although that certainly can be important, but often through what looks like a phase transition in physics, or just a nonlinear transition to a new way of thinking. Okay? So what the book does is describe this idea in a greater depth, obviously, with some of the mathematics, and we have some suggestions about how they can be implemented. And we're very fortunate to have people who actually work on the ground with this, people who know about real-world conflicts, such as Peter, and who work and have actually had experience in situations like this, like Bartoli and so forth. So it's a means of trying to take this general idea, which applies across nature, to see if we can use the same simple ideas, metaphors, and mathematics to try and capture what it is about conflict that makes it so intractable, and more importantly, how we can resolve that. So what I want to end with, though, is emphasizing, even though we're talking about systems as a whole, is the power of the individual in all this. There's a certain ironic stability to all these protracted conflicts. On the one hand, they're very resistant to frontal assaults. It's like trying to tell someone, you shouldn't be smoking cigarettes because you get cancer. They get defensive. They kind of already get that. They don't care. So you can't really attack people's beliefs. You can't attack the patterns head on. You get a lot of defensiveness. Okay? But at the same time, these conflicts can be very vulnerable to seemingly incidental events that have the capacity to reframe the conflict. And they do that, we think, through disassembling or introducing new elements that can't be integrated with the old pattern, and allows the system to rebuild itself in a more benign fashion. Okay? So Larry mentioned the chaotic systems, and in chaotic systems they are often characterized by something known as the butterfly effect. It's a very popular term. And the idea is that a very small little change introduced in a system can have ripple effects, surprising consequences that may take some time to unfold that can dramatically change the nature of the systems. Okay? And one person can do that. I'm just struck in reading the literature on conflict and in history how sometimes just one person doing something that's seemingly independent of the conflict itself can transform the conflict. So you think of Gandhi in India. He didn't go and try and solve the conflict per se. He went on a hunger strike. He modeled nonviolent civil disobedience. Martin Luther King in the United States sat in a Birmingham jail. And he didn't go out and try and talk people out of fighting and so forth. He just demonstrated a new way of behaving. Most recently in Afghanistan, everybody's heard about Malala Yousafzai. I probably butchered the name, I don't mean to do that. From Afghanistan, this now 16-year-old girl who may be in the process of changing the way people around the world think about what's going on in Afghanistan. And more to the point, a little bit later today, you're going to hear from Liebovitch from Liberia. And her story is absolutely remarkable. I didn't know too much about it until I learned about this conference, and I read up on it. And it just blew me away, because what she does there is deal with events that had nothing literally to do with the conflict itself. Among other things, she organized the women to have a sex strike against their husbands, which would bring almost any conflict I know involving men to a grinding halt. And it was remarkably effective. She was very instrumental in getting the women together in this women's movement. It didn't deal with the issues, the resources at stake, and the power struggles and so forth. But by entering into the system with a new way of thinking, it had a way of reframing much of what was going on in Liberia, and was very effective and efficient at bringing that civil war there to a successful end. So I just want to mention that even though we talk about these notions of systems and the complexity and emergent properties and so forth, in another sense, it really says individuals can, without having armies at their disposal, come in and really change dramatically the nature of a system. And we try and get that idea across in the book as well. Thanks.
So we have about 20 minutes to take questions, and Robin and Larry and I in some ways present the three stools of the dynamical systems approach, because we have the sort of complexity science, mathematics, social psychology, and I'm sort of the peace and conflict person representative here. So we're happy to take your questions, and I encourage you to challenge us. So again, what we're proposing is that this way of thinking and working with particularly these types of conflicts is radically different from most of the ways that we usually talk about addressing conflicts. And there is some evidence that there's value in this approach, but in some ways it's a new approach and it definitely needs testing. So we're interested in your questions and we're interested in your challenges at this point. I do want to say that I heard a kind of a hopeful metaphor or story on NPR as I was coming up here, which apparently today Paul McCartney has agreed to basically forgive Yoko Ono for breaking up the Beatles. So after all this time, he's said finally, he's ready to let this drop. And apparently George Harrison was trying to encourage him to do this for years, and he couldn't give it up. And so today he said, look, if John Lennon loved her, there's got to be something good there, and I'm willing to kind of build those bridges. So even these long-term intractable conflicts, like between Paul and Yoko, can come to an end. Questions? Any questions for the panel on what the heck does mathematics have to do with this, and how are they really employed? Anything from social psychology? Any questions? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask you the same thing. Well, let me take a stab at that. When we talk about the individual, I think actually the examples that Peter just gave about Yoko Ono, I mean, she really was just a single person. She broke up the most successful band in the world. I guess that's a way of looking at, not that the Beatles wanted to be broken up, and probably was not such a great thing. But yeah, I think individuals through their, without even really having the usual sorts of resources necessary to affect change, just by the virtue of their strength of character, or the novelty they bring to a situation, the surprise value perhaps, have a way of maybe destabilizing even a small portion of the system. And there can be ripple effects in the same way that the butterfly waving its wings in Argentina eventually causes a thunderstorm in Texas or something. Again, we haven't really developed this new formal models and so forth, but we do know that there's a big line of research in social psychology on minority influence. Bill Crane and several other people have been doing this for a number of years, and they show that often what looks like a strong press for uniformity in a social system, a society, where everybody gets in the same drumbeat and feels the same way, there's always a few people who are isolated or don't bend to the majority and have a minority opinion. If they're strong and they can maintain that type of conviction, if conditions change in the outside world, suddenly the minority can come and overtake the majority and change things dramatically. So when the communist regime fell in the late 80s, democracy swept through Poland and much of Eastern Europe, and capitalism became a very popular thing. That's the end of communism forever. But there are a few strongholds, a few communists who are left over who are very strong, who clustered together. And when jobs didn't come back right away, there was rampant unemployment and so forth, in the next election cycle, suddenly communists came back into power again. So the idea that even though there's a minority opinion, that minority can have strong impact under the right conditions.
Just one way to quickly respond to your question is, one of the ways that we've studied this, and I think Robin and Andrzej in particular have thought about it, is that people can synchronize. So if you're in relationships with people, you sort of begin to synchronize and develop certain patterns. And they've done studies on like dance groups, and they tend to synchronize, and their sort of biology can even synchronize. Or combat units who march together, they start to synchronize. And to some degree, patterns in conflict and patterns in war are a synchronization. They're a pattern that people sometimes are raised in, but it becomes very part of how they understand the world and respond to the world. And sometimes odd things can destabilize that pattern. So it can be some small gesture, it can be some conversation that happens, quietly behind doors that eventually has a destabilizing effect on that pattern, and then you can see radical change. It doesn't necessarily mean that the change is good. So a lot of the change we've seen associated with the Arabic Spring has been very destabilizing of countries and regions there, and some of them may be moving to a different form of synchronization, to a different kind of form of pattern that is more constructive, and some of them may just move back to a very similar place. So the disruption by an individual or by a minority group is just a force that can help kind of derail the pattern for a while, but where that pattern goes, we don't know. And so part of what needs to happen is that, as one of you said, I guess Robin said, you need to kind of create the possibility for another pattern, for a more constructive set of dynamics, and then the system can move to that.
Let me just add one more point to that occurred to me I didn't mention. When you have a destabilization of a pattern, it's precisely when the system is destabilized an individual may have the most impact, because the system tries to repair itself. And if you're a powerful person, have a good voice, or can demonstrate a new way of reframing, then you might have maximum impact. Maybe Martin Luther King wouldn't have had the impact maybe in the 40s. Maybe it had to take the late 50s, early 60s for him to have an impact. So the system has to be ripe for repair before an individual can have the same impact, despite being the same person in both contexts.
Let me add one thing to that also, which is we don't see examples in the rigorous mathematical model where if one person does something, they change a very large group. But what we do see is that if one person changes their behavior, because their behavior is different, how another person is responding to them is going to be different. The first person doesn't have to change the behavior of the second person or change what their strategy is to change how both of them are doing. So the dynamics can be changed by one person alone, just changing their behavior, changing their strategy, without necessarily forcing the other person to change their strategy, because they're reacting to the first person. So we've only seen that in models that have like two people, but there's a chance we might see that in other models, and we see that very clearly in these rigorous mathematical models.
Go ahead.
I know the world has enough conflict going on to keep you all busy for eternity, but have you thought about applications of your theories to other social problems? Because as I hear you speak, I can see individuals or groups thinking differently about the war on drugs or the war on poverty, which have conflict titles, but really aren't those kinds of conflicts.
Okay, social psychologist, right?
Go.
Good question. Okay. Yeah, I think this idea of reframing, of disassembling and reframing applies to things other than conflict, obviously. If you think about the way a person listens to a political debate, they go in a debate here and one person, give a spiel about something, and something doesn't sit right, they get destabilized just for a moment, and suddenly they have a brand new way of thinking about the candidate. People develop new habits, they break diets, they develop new lifestyles, sometimes just by something that interferes with the normal way of behaving. They hear a new way of, a new idea, for example, and that can just exist as a separate element for a while, but after a while it tends to have ripple effects, fester, and become a way of reframing the system. Years ago, a colleague of mine and I developed a theory about how people change their actions and learn how new ways of behaving and so forth. And the argument we made was that you don't change the way people think if they have maladaptive habits by telling them it's a maladaptive habit, okay? So we did a study, for example, with people who had eating problems. And rather than tell them, you're gonna get fat, or you're gonna get diabetic, and this is not good for you, we gave them chopsticks to eat Cheetos with. You know, it was silly, right? But in doing that, they learned to think in a very detailed way about the mechanics of something as simple as eating, which for them was a very overlearned habit. And that got them thinking about eating more generally, and pretty soon eating developed a new identity for them. It was getting healthy, it was getting nutrition, it was maybe having a social occasion, and it got them away from the maladaptive way of thinking about eating as something to, you know, soothe away their problems or something. So the idea you can change behaviors generally, maybe, I think if you watch effective politicians and communication agents, they very rarely challenge each other's opinions directly. They have a way of getting you to think a little more deeply about some facts or issues or elements you normally wouldn't consider, and then rebuild a frame for you. Psychotherapy, I think, works that way. I'm not an expert in psychotherapy, but you think about Freudian psychology or even behaviorism, very rarely do they come in and tell you, you shouldn't hate yourself, you're really a good person. That doesn't buy you anything. A Freudian psychologist will tell a patient, how many times did you have a slip of the tongue today? What did you dream about last night? How often do you wash your hands? Details. And in doing that, they get people synchronized in terms of all the minutiae of everyday life, and then gradually, from the outside, you can start building a brand new frame for what they're doing, and maybe get them to think differently about their lives.
There was another question. Go ahead.
I'm wondering if it's getting people to change their behavior or getting them to change their thinking, or does one come before the other, or is there maybe kind of give any information on that?
So the question is it getting people to change their behavior or change their
Yeah.
thinking, or?
That's a very interesting issue. In social psychology, there's a lot of controversy about, you know, which comes first, thought or action. And the truth, of course, is it's both. There's positive feedback loops among them. But quite often, to affect change in individual psychology, at least, you get people to do something that they otherwise wouldn't do, and then the mind goes into overdrive trying to make sense of what they just did. If you don't supply a lot of external reasons for it, then they really have to dig deep to try and justify what they've done. So, you know, if you pay people a lot of money for telling a story that they really don't believe, ask them, do you believe what you just said? No, I got paid money. If you get a person to tell the same story they don't believe, don't pay them any money, ask them if they believe, they say, yeah, kind of. They start convincing themselves. So the mind follows action sometimes. So quite often it might be easier, even in conflict situations, to get people to engage in different everyday practices. And then their mind might come around to sort of justify and make sense of what they've done.
I think, though, the hard reality is that what comes first in change? Is it thinking or is it behaving? And the answer is yes, because there are many roads to it. And sometimes it is an action will take place, and then you will consider why you did what you did and who you are in relation to that. And sometimes it is about working directly with beliefs. So change can come from different paths, I think, yeah. Claudia, go ahead, and then I'll come here.
Intrigued by the possibility that there are no patterns, and that when you disrupt one pattern, you might develop, scientists might develop pathology of what other patterns might exist. And I wonder if that's something you're looking at, is something that's fruitful. I'm thinking of Howard Gabler, the ombuds at NIH, who talks about the predictable, I think he calls it the succession dilemma, where scientist has a young upstart in his or her lab, and there's a predictable pattern of conflict that occurs.
Thank you, good idea.
Oh, thank you. Oh, boy, what did I say?
So I'll summarize. So
Peter?
Claudia's asking if there are some kind of archetypal patterns that are evident in conflict dynamics or in interpersonal dynamics that you can track and then see similarities across different types of situations.
And that then if you were to disrupt one, you might have a prediction about what other pattern it would, you know.
Move to.
Slip into or move
Okay.
to.
You want to try that?
Okay, there's a marvelous book written, many of you are familiar with, years ago by Thomas Kuhn. the structure of scientific revolutions. You may be familiar with that. If you think about it, what he was really writing about was dynamical systems in some sense. I mean, he talked about how science forms these paradigms, we use the word paradigm today, which become these comprehensive frameworks, theories, and methods that all kind of fit together to explain a phenomenon, and they resist challenge. An upstart comes along, and I can tell you NSF will resist hearing challenges quite often in grant proposals. Journals will too. You sort of rally around, because it's a coherent way of thinking, and to have it challenges, you mount the defenses, just like we do in our everyday life. But science does change. Theories do evolve. Theories are disrupted, and new theories come to supplant them. So this idea of having a pattern which resists change finally gets disrupted, and a new idea comes along, which is critical for Kuhn. You have to have an alternative idea. It provides a way of reassembling all the facts, the phenomena, the methodology, and so forth into a new whole. So I think this idea of assembly, disassembly, and reconfiguration, this pattern, is probably pervasive not just for the formation of galaxies and neural dynamics, but for science and conflict. It's a very general way of thinking about how things work.
So just to respond to a point of your question, so there are people that study, so David Strom is one who studies systemic approaches to peace, and he has been sort of identified what he sees as sort of archetypal patterns that become evident more and more in certain domains. Family therapy, family systems people have identified certain kinds of patterns that are common. It's not really an approach that this team has taken. This team has looked more at the underlying dynamics and mechanisms, but not at any kind of sort of coherent set of stories that come up again and again. Part of that just might be how we've approached the work, I think. Yeah. You had a question?
Let me
Oh,
just
sorry, go
add
ahead.
one
Yeah,
line to that,
please.
which is that from what Robin was describing, it's both heartening and disheartening that scientific theories, that science is actually done by people, and how they handle scientific theories in some ways, and whether they believe them and when they can change them is just as easy or difficult as other people dealing in conflicts or other social situations. It's not just hypothesis, experiment, testing, that science is actually done by real people that behave as people.
I'll tell you a little inside secret, maybe I shouldn't do this, but as a scientist or as a psychologist, when you read a journal article, or even a book for that matter, maybe I shouldn't say this, it looks like, well, we thought it all out and we just wrote it. No. It didn't happen that way at all. I can tell you in the midst of writing a chapter, even a paragraph, suddenly it'll all get disassembled and I'll reconfigure it. It becomes a brand new thing and a new thought pops up. There's an aha moment and so forth. And it comes up by the time we're at the end, quite a bit different than when we originally envisioned. Maybe the overall arc of the story is still there, still dynamical systems and so forth, but the actual points we make and the way we make them is constantly evolving through this process of assembly, disassembly, and reconfiguration.
You had a question, go ahead. Yes.
I want to ask about how we can translate human relationships, interactions, into mathematics, which is full of emotions and contradictions.
Right, well, we
I'm gonna
can't.
go over here.
Okay, we can't do all of that. What we can do is take, at least at this point, we can take some salient characteristics of how people behave. And instead of describing that in words, we can write down, if this person does something, what will the other person do? What they're doing now, we can say, and we can write it down mathematically, what they're doing now will affect a certain time into the future what they're going to do next. So instead of making these descriptions in words, we can put some of the most essential properties of what they're doing into the equations. When we have that, we can run the equations. We can change some of the parameters of the equations, and very often the results of computing that will tell us something that we wouldn't have expected. We can create a little artificial world that's not going to be, as you rightly point out, as robust and as inclusive of everything that people do. But maybe some things that people do that if we put into the equations, we can see this little toy model do something, and we can change it and see if it does something else. This has been the approach that physics started to use about 350 years ago, starting with Newton. Before Newton, people described the world around them in words. And what Newton said was that that wasn't good enough, that if you wrote down an equation that described gravity, you could actually learn a lot more. And from a very few simple equations, Newton was able to explain the tides, how the moon went around the earth, how the planets went around the sun. And what we're seeing now is that some of the things that we thought we could only explain in words in social science, we can also write down some of the equations. The real challenge now is that we're shifting to a slightly different paradigm. So the jargon phrase, at least in business and in some parts of social science, is something called big data, where now we can analyze many, many different things at the same time. So DoubleClick knows every website you've looked at on your browser and things like that. And we're using that sort of amount of data to cover some of the things you're raising in your question, which is the models that I do are very, very simple, but maybe with more complicated models we can see things. And again, the tremendous advantage of this, there's a line by Goethe that says leaves are green and all theories are gray. And we understand that, but sometimes we can capture something and see there's an essential thing of how people are interacting. And if we have this toy model, we can play with it and make it do unexpected consequences and therefore learn something from it.
The only thing I would add to that is that mathematics alone or words alone don't do it. I think it's the interplay between people who take these different approaches. So a nice mathematical model, we test that in laboratory studies or maybe through a computer simulation or through archival data. Then we go back to the mathematicians and tweak the equations. So it's an iterative process, a synergistic process, that allows us to get to a truth that each approach by itself wouldn't have arrived at.
Just very briefly to add to that, one of the things that Howard Gadlin, who was just mentioned before at NIH, says that when people work in interdisciplinary groups, the hardest thing is from people from different perspectives to value the merit of someone with a different approach. And I think within our group, we've been able to do that. So we have different approaches, but each of us respect the approaches of the other people. And actually, that's harder to do than you would think sometimes.
So I know there are many questions. You had a question, and then I'll come back to a couple of other people. But go ahead. Yes, you.
My question is with Mr. Sir Robert. Sir, your presentation about the psychoanalysis of the conflict was wonderful. But one thing I don't agree is that the examples you have given for the individuals who change the face of the situation, where you have mentioned that Malala Yousafzai from Afghanistan. He is from Pakistan. He is living just 550 kilometers away from me. He is born there, she hit there, she educated there, and she has done everything in Pakistan. Thank you.
Go ahead, back there, all the way back. Yeah, that's you.
Thank you. I had a question about the practical applications of the theory. The three examples you cited, at least two of the three, King and Gandhi, involve the use of nonviolent civil disobedience in order to, I would say, almost insert conflict into a stagnated, oppressive social system. And I'm wondering if most of the examples that you looked at of this new model to upset an existing pattern, did they all involve forms of civil disobedience? Does that seem to be part of the answer?
Peter, you might want to address that because I'm thinking about Andrea's work in Mozambique and so forth.
Yeah, so I mean, the answer is not necessarily. They typically involve odd things. They involve oftentimes unexpected things. So an example is in Mozambique, there was a 16-year civil war that came on the heels of an independence war and on the heels of hundreds of years of colonialism. So there was this system that had these destructive dynamics that were very resistant to change. And one night, there was a conversation that took place in the jungle, illegally, in the middle of the night, by an African bishop, a Mozambican Catholic bishop, and the leader of the rebel group, Renamo. And as they came together to speak, and everyone at this point is concerned about their life, because what they were doing was dangerous and illegal, it happened that they came from the same ethnic group, and they spoke the same dialect. And no one knew this before it happened, but there was this kind of serendipitous moment that took place, and it affected their ability to speak with each other, trust each other, have a conversation that was real and meaningful, and lead to other conversations and other alternatives that ultimately contributed to destabilizing this strong pattern in Mozambique. So it wasn't a pattern of nonviolence or disobedience. It wasn't a radical gesture. It was a small thing, but it was a surprise. And that surprise helped over time contribute to the unraveling of that conflict and to the capacity for it to move into a very different kind of pattern. So what typically does happen are some kinds of odd surprises, things that, oftentimes people come into a system who aren't socialized in that system, and they say, well, why do you do things this way? Why don't you do them this way? And if there's enough energy and charisma, and if the system's ready, then that can move it and that can change it. So it's not always what we think. And in fact, oftentimes the things that we think would make the difference are not what make the difference. Yeah. So we're going to have to go. Maybe we can take one or two more quick ones. Roy, I think you had a question?
I had a question, but Mary sort of touched on it. I was just thinking, your book is called Attracted to Conflict. There are about 7 of you who wrote it. You come from it's a multidisciplinary team. I'm sure there was, it's very smooth and everything, but I'm sure there's a little bit of conflict there as well, right? Constructive conflict.
What do you mean? Oh, sorry.
So I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit of the process of having a team of...
I'm going to leave this to you.
Well, okay, as Peter pointed out, most conflicts are constructive. Very few conflicts lead to, violence and bad things. And in fact, you wouldn't have parliamentary democracy without conflict. You wouldn't have a really good marriage if a person just followed the orders of the other person. There has to be some sort of tension. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of conflict, I think, which was largely constructive. There was moments there where things kind of came to a halt. But we left the room in peace. And I think in large part that most of the conflicts we had were very positive. As Larry pointed out, it's very difficult to get a multidisciplinary team together. I think maybe European countries are a little bit better at this. They deal with big data, and they didn't have quite the resources we had, so they had to have people share resources more effectively in the United States. When I first went to Poland, for example, I would give a talk, and physicists would show up, and architects and so forth, because they didn't have cyclotrons, they didn't have a lot of fancy equipment. They wanted to hear ideas. But even here in the United States, we're finding that it's possible to bring people together with very different perspectives. And it's not always a smooth ride. It's not always linear. Sometimes there's transition points where it could go either way, but then we get back on track.
I would say my view from backstage of this was I don't think there was so much fights over intellectual issues. I think the first time I did a book, not this book, I did it with 3 other authors. And from my experience doing that, the next book I wrote entirely by myself. And I think there were issues of just a bunch of people writing a book together. So I think there were things like that, which I think always happen. But I don't think there was like people didn't have their intellectual knives or swords out at each other. I think that part of the process, I think, actually went very well.
I agree with that. I was very amazed by everybody who's worked on this book and this project, because they had such different perspectives. First of all, I didn't have the depth of knowledge that challenged them, number one. Maybe if I could have, I would have. But I was very impressed by how much passion they brought to it and how much, what skill sets they had and so forth. And I think it worked largely, in the big scheme of things, harmoniously.
Okay, I think we have enough time for 1 or 2 more questions, actually.
Good rep.
Okay, so one more question? Yeah.
I guess 2 questions. One,
Thanks.
one is just sort of in response to Kuhn, since I'm so happy to
Okay,
hear his name again.
I'm sorry?
And the second, and that is more or less, at what point does this sort of go from Kuhn to Lakatos? And that sort of leads into this larger question that you're discussing science and you're discussing metaphor, and I hear a lot more metaphor than science, and I almost hear very little about what I would see as sort of the standard aspects of social science. So I'm wondering, I guess, how you understand science and its relation to social science, which has a 100-year tradition, which you haven't really said very much about today.
Well, we haven't talked about the research at all, but the research, we are scientists, so we do experiments, we do computer simulations. We're pretty good at data mining through big data. We have archival data. The actual boots on the ground, the actual methods really have to meet the tenets of science in order to get published. So what we try to describe today is just in a more general term, maybe a little bit overly metaphorical, but the idea is that really provide the umbrella for all the more specific scientific things we do in this process.
Right, we haven't talked, so each of us do a little bit different things. What I actually do is we make mathematical models and we set up experiments. We're currently video recording therapists and clients, and then we see whether what we see in the experiments matches the data. And we also use other techniques like power spectrum or correlation things to analyze data from experiments. So it's very classical type of science that we really haven't described in detail.
Just one
here.
final point on that. Often in some of our simulations, for example, we'll take individuals modeled as separate dynamical systems with a logistic equation, and then couple them in various ways and show the emergence of a higher order unit that synchronizes them. So I think that's, so we didn't mention because that gets a little bit into the weeds in what we do, but we're very sensitive to the idea that we can't just stick with metaphors. We actually have to have implementation through rigorous means.
All right, so on my piece of paper here, it says to say thank you, and we're happy to move on.
Thank you.